Since the end of last year, we've seen a lot of activity by China in the Spratly Islands. Spratly Islands is in the southern part of the South China Sea. It's quite an interesting part of the world because it's, of course, disputed and claimed by a number of our countries: the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, China, and Taiwan. Now, what we've seen recently is that China's trying to kind of build up its presence there. It's the only major claimant that doesn't have an airfield or an island with an airfield on it. Now, it's trying to change that, we think, by reclaiming reefs, turning reefs and underwater kind of areas into proper islands made of sand, and it's going to build on these. And from what we can tell, based on plans that have been released by various Chinese organizations, they're looking to build airfields, they're looking to build ports, they're looking to build all kinds of structures that will really give China much greater reach in the southern part of the South China Sea. So it's interesting because China hasn't had a reach into the southern part of the South China Sea because it hasn't had airfields or ports from which to operate from. What we've seen is the way in which it's doing this is it's not using its military, it's using dredgers, it's using civilian operators, which are state-owned, but they're still civilian, to really build up a presence there. So far, the only kind of nations that have really taken note of this are Vietnam and the Philippines. Although if it continues, I think we would expect the United States, which of course is a Philippine treaty partner, to maybe make a statement and also to maybe act, because this could threaten freedom of navigation, it could threaten sea lanes. It's quite a big strategic change in the picture in the South China Sea. China's making these moves in the Spratly Islands because, like I say, it hasn't had reach in this part of the world. Why is it doing that? Well, it looks at the South China Sea as its near seas, its domain. It's very concerned about the fact that the majority of its trade and the majority of its oil and energy imports come through this body of water, and at the moment it hasn't really got control over it. It's a contested area. For China, economically, that isn't going to work. For China, strategically, that isn't going to work. So if you look at it from their perspective, from China's perspective, it makes absolute sense to have greater control over this area. Now, recently we went to a couple of maritime conferences where there's some very interesting comments about what China is doing and why China is doing this. One of the key reasons is that China is looking out from a continental perspective. That is to say, it's a land power looking out at the sea. Now, land powers tend to understand things in terms of what you can control, whereas maritime powers tend to look at things in terms of what you can negotiate, because the sea is not an area in which you control. It's an area in which you negotiate with other sea users to share ownership or to share resources and share access. China is probably trying to change the way in which people or nations understand and use the maritime sphere, and that's a big change. The effect of China's moves in the Spratlys and also the Paracel Islands, where of course it's been doing some work with oil rigs that has annoyed Vietnam quite a lot, is quite deep and quite profound. One of the key things is it's going to encourage other actors in the region, whether that's the Philippines or Vietnam, to of course react and of course look at whether they need to build up their military in a way that they're not at the moment. Of course, the big question is, how does the United States react? So far, we've seen at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June, there was quite a robust statement from Chuck Hagel, the Defense Secretary, which was all about the actions of China in the maritime sphere, but we haven't seen any specific response from the United States about what's happening in the Spratlys at the moment. I think we might see that change if we do see air bases being built there, and of course air bases manned by military aircraft. So that's something to look forward to. Another nation which would be very interesting to look out for is what Singapore thinks about this. Singapore, of course, has a very key strategic position where it is, going into the Malacca Strait. Anything that happens in the South China Sea, and especially in the southern part of the South China Sea, could affect its interests. So we'll have to keep an eye on what Singapore thinks about this. And of course, another major issue is what Malaysia thinks about this. Malaysia so far has kind of managed to avoid really getting involved in territorial disputes with China because it's so far away from the areas which China has really been acting in. But this is going to change that. I mean, if China has reached down into the southern part of the South China Sea, that is also going to affect Malaysia's interests.